ערב טוב, נשאר להתקיים באנגלית, תסלחו לי אם אני עובר לשפה ההיא. Good evening everybody, my name is Gabriel Motzkin. I'm the director of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and I earnestly request you to change the setting on your phone so that we don't become the privileged members of a musical concert. I think that this is a very special evening because it's very rare that we have something that is both of such particular and such universal significance as the history of Matzpen. And the volume about Matzpen was published in German, so we thought, should we have the evening in German? Then we realized that most of you won't be here. Then we thought we'd do it in Hebrew, but the problem is not all our speakers know Hebrew that well, so we can do it in Hebrew. So we settled on English as a compromise language. Now, Matzpen is an interesting phenomenon because so many of the prophecies of Matzpen came true. Matzpen, after all, has to be seen in the history of dissonant communism. In other words, of something that came out of the communist movement, and then, like Euro-communism and all these movements, tried to come up with some universal theory, anticipated the theory of post-colonialism, and certainly anticipated the movement that we had in the 90s called post-Zionism. It was an incredibly small group of people, and it had an incredibly huge impact on the discourse between left and right in Israel. Now, is that a good impact? That's a question for you to decide, because I sometimes think that maybe we who are more on the left somehow failed our mission in not being able to convince all those people out there who vote for the right that they should actually do something different. And extremism is not always the best tactic, and extremism, of course, is relative to the conditions. Be that as it may, this is one of these phenomena that has not been studied enough, and here Lutz Fiedler has come up with a major path-breaking book on this subject. And basically what you need to know about him is that he did his dissertation on Matzpen, basically, and this is the expanded version of that. And since October 2014, he's a postdoctoral research fellow at the ERC Research Project, Judging History's Experience, Judgment, and Representation of World War II in an Age of Globalization. That's at the Hebrew University. Now we're going to do this in two parts. First, I'm going to ask Lutz to speak, and then I'll present a commentator, Celia Beera, and after that we'll open it up for a discussion which I hope will be vigorous. So, Lutz, please, the floor is yours.
Well, תודה רבה, ערב טוב. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Professor Gabriel Motzkin, for this kind introduction. And thank you, Shulamit Laron, and the staff of the Van Leer Institute for making this event possible. I'm really excited to be here, very close to a place where I once used to live, like 13 years ago, when I was for the first time in Israel. And I have also a feeling of humility in a way, humility and respect, because for having the possibility to present here a book on the Israeli New Left, on the Palestine conflict, and also deals with questions about the Holocaust. And the book that was written in German, in Germany, so I'm very happy to present it here to you. And since it was a dissertation, I want to thank also like my supervisor, Dan Diener, who actually was a major influence besides the movie of Iran that also caused my interest in Matzpen. And I want to thank all the people from Matzpen who helped me during these years. So now we see what you think about it. And I started thought not to start to present the book like by going chapter through chapter, but like with a story. And then I somehow come back to the book. It was already late afternoon when the feverish atmosphere of May 1st, 1969, escalated in the heart of Tel Aviv. On one side of the grand Dizengoff Boulevard, demonstrators from the Communist Party, the old left, arrived. Coming from Jaffa in the south of Tel Aviv, the members of the Israeli Socialist Organization, which had seceded from the Israeli Communist Party 7 years earlier, approached. By that time, the whole country would know them under the name of their newspaper, Matzpen. When both groups faced each other on the Dizengoff Boulevard, not only the opposition of old and new left divided them. Much more relevant was the deep split that had emerged in the wake of the Six-Day War less than 2 years earlier, in consequence of which Israel had incorporated East Jerusalem and occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. After all, the Arab annihilation threats preceding that war had nourished existential worries and also a fear of a new Holocaust throughout the whole country to such an extent that even the Israeli Communist Party, Maki, had joined in the collective appraisal of a necessary self-defensive war. During the demonstration held an afternoon of May 1st, they had passed on their thanks to the Israeli military forces. An unprecedented unity across all parties prevailed in the country. Only those belonging to the Israeli Socialist Organization had stepped out of that national unity and directed their attention to the outside instead. They especially focused on the situation of the Palestinians, while the Israeli society still discussed whether the areas gained with the war were either military occupied, administrated, or even liberated territories. The young leftists declared without further ado that from a Palestinian perspective, it was none of those, but plainly foreign occupation and oppression. Consequently, Matzpen had already agitated for an unconditional withdrawal from all occupied territories immediately after the June War. Their demand boiled down in the sweeping slogan, Hala HaKibush, down with the occupation, which they also shouted while demonstrating in the streets of May 1st, 2 years later. The followers of the Communist Party, however, were not about to take this provocation unreplied when they were confronted with the new leftists and their red flags. Within only a few seconds, the party communists turned their flags and banners into barriers and rods to bear the Matzpen group the way and to disperse its members. A lively confrontation started, and it even came to violent fisticuffs. On the following day, most of the Israeli daily press reported about that turmoil. Matzpen, the Hebrew word for compass, was also the name of the political group that, like no other, should keep the Israeli society in suspense after the Six-Day War. Even though the Israeli Socialist Organization, with just a few dozen of members, was at first sight a marginal phenomenon, it had gained high importance in Israel in the years after the war. With their call for an immediate ending of the occupation, but especially because of their announced solidarity with the resistance of the Palestinian organizations, the group had quickly become a symbol for national treason and Jewish self-hatred, if not to say for the identification with the enemy. Not least due to the fact that with their slogans, they had gained much in popularity within the new left outside the country, especially at European and American universities. When Nachum Goldman, then president of the World Jewish Congress, publicly declared his ambitions to establish direct contacts with the Egyptian president Nasser, his opponents discredited him as being a Matzpenik himself. And after a letter by a group of high school graduates reached Prime Minister Golda Meir, in which they expressed their doubts on their own government's peace intentions and threatened to refuse their service in the army because she had forbidden any talks with Egypt, the press went head over heels over Matzpen's dramatic influence on the Israeli students. Still, the resentment, the rejection, even the hatred the new left of Matzpen had to endure after the Six-Day War referred to other emotional frictions than the provocative protest against the Israeli occupation could have brought about. All of this was much more about the mere existence of the Jewish state itself. Just like the war had brought back the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the surface of dispute, but was not at all its origin and trigger, the protest Matzpen took out to the public did not end at the borders of 1967. With their call for a socialist revolution, which would both overcome Israel's Zionist character and radically change the Arab regimes in the region in order to create a community of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs in a socialist Middle East, they challenged the very foundations of the Jewish state. Sure, their optimistic internationalism had given them the opportunity to rethink Israel's conflict in Palestine, as well as the conditions of a secure Jewish-Israeli existence in the Middle East. In an era after Auschwitz, however, when the Jewish world was almost without exception was united in its solidarity with Israel, such an optimism touched up on a collective self-conception that regarded the existence of a Jewish state as a last resort for Jewish life after the Holocaust. But who were those Israeli dissidents? What were their political motives, and what drove them? What made them turn against the political mainstream of Israeli society, and what led to their harsh criticism they had to experience? These were the questions that haunted me when I started to do research on my book that I have the pleasure to present to you today. To be frank, the task to answer them was a difficult one, and it remained so until the end. Writing in German and writing in Germany predestines every perspective on Israel and the Palestine conflict. However, it was precisely against this background that I wanted to understand the reasons for political criticism, which characterized itself as anti-Zionism and was embedded in the utopia of revolutionary socialism. In the end, the result of my research did not lead into just another story of the New Left. The history of Matzpen, as I've tried to understand it, manifested itself instead as a different Israeli history. In the following, I want to present you this history as I've told it in my book. This means, of course, that I can share with you only a section from the history of Matzpen, as a book never can offer an all-embracing history. I rather did seek to highlight certain aspects of the self-perception of the Matzpen members and try to relate them to broader questions of Jewish, Israeli, and general history. The structure of my presentation, therefore, mirrors the structure of the book, although I will omit one chapter here about the collaboration of Matzpen with leftists from the Arab world that culminated in the publication of the journal Khamsin. But we can always address this topic in the discussion. So let me quickly tell you what I will do in the next couple of minutes, and you can see it there. First, I will speak about the political origins of the group and its splits from Israeli communism. Second, I will focus on Matzpen's concept of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and possible ways of its solution as they evolved before 1967. And third, I will contextualize Matzpen within the larger discussion on the cultural perception of Israeli Jewry as the new Hebrew nation. Fourth, I will connect Matzpen's activity to the history of the New Left in general that led, against the background of the Palestine conflict, to several splits of the group. And in the fifth and last part, I will discuss the rather uncomfortable fact that Matzpen's critical outlook on the Palestine conflict meant the exclusion of the effects the Holocaust had on Jewish existence. After all, I hope this will give us enough material for fruitful discussion. The history of Matzpen, to come to my first point, started way less spectacular with a small group of dissidents who split off from the Communist Party already in 1962. When Kol Ha'am, the Communist Party newspaper, reported about the expulsion of Akiva Or, Moshe Machova, Odette Pilavsky, and Yirmiyahu Kaplan for the accusation of treason and the formation of factions, the conflict with Palestine was not yet in the center of the debate. Instead, the internal discussions focused rather on the upheavals in the wake of Soviet head of state Nikita Khrushchev's secret revelations at the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, which was followed by a crisis of faith in the entire communist world. But although the party leaders in Israel had tried anything in order to forestall the discussion on the now-known Stalinist crimes, in their own ranks, they were not capable of preventing the unwelcome questions posed by Machova and Or in Jerusalem and by Pilavsky and Kaplan in Tel Aviv. Those questions did not only address the reasons why the Soviet Union refused to support the revolutionary movements from Cuba to Iraq. Beyond that, they were demanding to know about the past of the local Communist Party in Palestine and why its history had not been written to that point. With their pressing questions, they aimed, of course, at the fact that the heads of the Palestinian Communist Party had also fallen victim to the Stalinist purges in the 30s. First and foremost, the dissidents were highly indignant that none of the points at issue could be openly discussed and that the party was reluctant to give way to an internal democratization. But since their criticism fell on deaf ears again and again, the expulsion was only the reverse side of their own decision to call a new movement into life, which should represent the revolutionary claims of the young leftists and become no less than a new compass of history. It was only some years later, in the light of 1968, when the founders of Matzpen had come to realize that their own emergence was somehow connected to a much broader historical development. And just as the repulsion from Stalinist communism was a common experience of the new left in Europe and America, also the members of Matzpen had shared the universalist utopia of the new independent movement, the struggle for a socialist revolution based on the unity of class that would transcend ethnic and national belongings, and the belief in a socialist internationalism based on the ideas of recognition and national self-determination to overcome national and colonial conflicts. Still, although the founding of Matzpen was in many ways similar to the path of the European New Left, regional specifics and objections to the Marquee Party's analysis of Israel's society and the Middle East conflict already played a role in the very early evolution of the Israeli New Left. Akiva All has recalled the split 30 years later with the following words, and I quote him, and you can read it also there. In fact, we were in conflict with Marquee on 3 major points. We thought that the Histadrut should be dissolved. We argued that there existed no true socialism in the Soviet Union. And we pointed out that the conflict in the Middle East is rooted in the situation of the Palestinians, and that it was them we had to come to terms with, not Nasser or Damascus. End of quote. Already, in the very early evolution of the Israeli New Left, the carol within the Communist Party extended to questions of the Middle East conflict. The book, Shalom, Shalom, Ve'en Shalom, Peace, Peace, and There's No Peace, published by Akiva Or and Moshe Machover 5 years after the Suez Crisis of 1956, has resulted in severe discord. Even though they initially had intended to support with their book the interpretation of the Communist Party, according to which Israel's conflict with the Arab neighbors rooted in the political relationships of the Jewish state with the Western and partly colonial world, their narrative changed while working on the manuscript. Now they turned to the Palestine conflict and the unrealized foundation of a Palestinian state as it was guaranteed in the partition plan of the United Nations from November 1947. And while their mother party still accused British imperialism for the historic failure as well as for the Palestinian refugee problem, the connection between the founding of the Jewish state and the Palestinian catastrophe moved to the foreground of the dissidents' interpretation. In the 1950s and 1960s Israel, where the Palestine question and the actual existence of a Palestinian people was somewhat hidden by the talk of a cross-national conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Machover and Or belonged to the first to reveal this covered struggle accompanying the founding of the Jewish state. That was the pioneer achievement of the book, which at the same time was another cause for the conflict with the Communist Mother Party. Still, the young dissidents should only come to an independent interpretation of the Palestine conflict after they had detached themselves completely from the Communist Party and in the wake of historical processes outside the Jewish state. And I come to the second part, now, that deals now with the Palestine conflict. When in spring of 1962, so in the same year as of Matzpen's foundation, the war in Algeria ended after 8 horrific years, its shadows also affected Israel and the Palestine conflict. After all, this war had not only led to Algeria's independence from France, but also to the hasty escape of over 1 million French Algerians. For the formerly privileged so-called Pieds Noirs, there was no space left in post-colonial Algeria, and that, despite the fact that the country had mostly been their only home for generations at this point. Shortly after, when the designated Algerian president Ahmed Ben Bella declared that also the liberation of Palestine must be aspired, for Matzpen, the Algerian situation became a catalyst for the threatening insight that the fate of the French Algerians mirrored the situation of the Israeli Jews. Thus, Matzpen argued that Israel's conflict with the Palestinians was not the classical example of two native nationalities fighting over the same territory, but rather the clash of a European population aiming to establish a state with the pre-located native residents that had begun long before the foundation of Israel. As a conflict on the founding and continuation of a Jewish nation-state in a mainly Arab environment, it seemed just as insoluble as the Algerian one, while the situation of the Israeli Jews was even more dramatic than it had been for the French Algerians. So Matzpen concluded on its pages, you can see it there, from time to time, we tend to forget about the fact that our position is similar to the French settlers in Algeria, with the only distinction that our situation is way less comfortable. They had the support of a metropole, which we are lacking. Yet, this perspective on the conflict's nature, as a colonial conflict in fact, was not that new, since it had been shared by right-wing Zionists in the pre-state Yishuv. Even Vladimir Jabotinsky, the far-sighted founding father of revisionist Zionism, had already emphasized in his canonical text on the Iron Wall, and I quote him, that there can be no hope to obtain the consent of the Palestinian Arabs to the idea of turning Palestine into a country with a Jewish majority. End of quote. This kind of analysis had entered Matzpen's ranks, obviously via the opposite political tradition. Namely, when the German Jewish Trotzkite Jakob Taut and the Palestinian communist Jabra Nicola joined Matzpen shortly after it came to life. Both shared a much longer political career as critics of the Zionist project, since before 1948 they belonged to a circle of anti-Stalinist communists already, which had published a passionate pamphlet that had argued against the foundation of a Jewish state and for a common Jewish-Arab perspective in a unified socialist Middle East. But although this hope was already outdated at this time, Nicola and Taut later turned into the intellectual teachers for a new generation of the radical Israeli left and taught them about the long history of the conflict between Zionist colonization and the Palestinian Arabs. For the members of Matzpen, it became, however, equally important that the pre-state conflict between the Zionist project and the Palestinian Arabs was also extended into the inner structure of the new state as an ongoing tension between its Jewish and its democratic character. The privileged status of the Jewish population, institutionalized with the law of return and the nationality laws, had to be perceived as a collective discrimination by the Israeli Arabs, a situation aggravated by land expropriation and the military administration of the first 2 decades. Thus, the members of Matzpen seriously doubted their own state would face a safe future, and their doubts did not only root in their egalitarian convictions. The sword of Damocles hanging over Israel's contested existence and the unfulfilled national aspirations of the Palestinians was actually Algerian independence, which had turned even more threatening in the wake of the historical process of decolonization. The newspaper Matzpen accordingly stated that if the Jewish Israelis do not turn away from the Zionist movement, they have to prepare for the same fate as the French settlers in Algeria who had not turned away from colonialism. It was against this background that Matzpen envisioned a refoundation or even a reinvention of Israeli state and society. In some regards, the outlook resembled the position of the French Algerian writer Albert Camus, who had imagined a post-colonial Algeria being the home of Arabic and French Algerians alike. The young Israelis of Matzpen owed their perspective of an Israel free of conflict mostly to the socialist outlook and the internationalist conviction that has constituted the precondition for all their demands. A belief in a better future that should be the fundament for political change in the present. Such a revolutionary utopia did first and foremost culminate in the demand for a transformation of Israel into a state of all its citizens, and the abolishment of all institutionalized forms enforcing a political supremacy and Jewish demographic majority vis-à-vis the Palestinian Arabs. And while it meant, on the one hand, the demand for an abolishment of the law of return, they argued for a Palestinian right to return on the other. No less, the idea of a socialist revolution was inspired by the vision of a modernized and secularized Arab world, which would at the same time secure the recognition of the Jewish Israelis as a nation with equal rights in the region. This was the irreducible condition expressed by the Israeli left. And I quote from Moshe Machover this time, "It is correct that this nationality goes back to the Zionist settlement politics, and that this process took place at the expense of the Arab Palestinian people. But despite the fact that it was created by Zionism, a Hebrew nation now exists in Palestine." End of quote. This entailed a historic claim from the side of Matzpen, while acknowledging the initial process of foreign settlement of the Jews in Palestine, while acknowledging the initial process of foreign settlement of the Jews in Palestine, they hoped the Arab world would recognize the transformation the Jewish people underwent within a generation, the transformation of European Jews into a Hebrew nation, Ha'am Ivri, as a native nationality, detached from its Zionist past and belonging to the region by then. Talking about a new Hebrew nation that had emerged inside the country was not only a political challenge for the self-conception of the new Jewish state, but also echoed the conflict which had existed ever since the Jewish settlements had begun, and which continued in the struggle about the cultural roots of the Israeli state. Therewith, I come to the third part of my presentation, discussing the cultural milieu of Matzpen. It has its own importance, since the idea of a new but yet separate national community was a serious drain on the Zionist conception of a trans-territorial unity of the Jewish people, which was to be brought together in Israel. A specific Hebrew national culture, which first evolved under the protection of the British mandatory and was established deliberately in opposition to the diasporic Jewish existence, was however the result of Zionism itself. The Jews, as a diasporic population, transformed into a Hebrew nation with a separate territory and its own language. Anyhow, also the concept of a Hebrew nation was by no means an invention of the Israeli left. Its origins date back to the 19th century, and it later became popularized within the Yeshuv and mostly among right-wing Zionism, whose most eccentric branch was the so-called Canaanite movement, HaKnaanim. A Hebrew cannot be a Jew, just as a Jew cannot be a Hebrew, wrote its founding father in 1944, despite the fact that he himself had come from Warsaw to Palestine as a child and only then turned from Uriel Halperin into Jonathan Ratosh. Yet, the generation of the native-born children of Jewish immigrants who detached themselves from their parents' cultural experience and developed their own national culture should prove him correct. While there was no need for this generation to relate to ancient myths of a far distant past, their belonging to a new Hebrew nation found its expression mainly in a cultural and habitual change, in their ways to dress and their modes of behavior. However, the change expressed itself most significantly in the realm of language. While for the diasporic Jews, the Hebrew language was mostly a sacred language of liturgy, its nature changed to a secular and profane everyday native language. A whole milieu, which is amongst others connected to the names of Shimon Tzabar, Amos Kenan, Dan Ben Amotz, and was pivotally attached to Uri Avneri's weekly newspaper Ha'olam Hazeh, has emerged around this new national and linguistic culture. And while it was on the one hand Ha'olam Hazeh and also the so-called Semitic Action Group, Hapi'olah Hashemi, that constituted the cultural background for some of the Matzpen members, it was the environment of the Jerusalem-based Café Ta'amon on the other, where the Hebrew youth of the 60s and 70s had overlapped with the meetings and activities of Matzpen. Thus, Matzpen had also arose from this cultural environment. It was its left wing that carried its goals even further by declaring that a new Hebrew national culture would be a crucial requirement for cutting the ideological strap of the law of return between diasporic Jews and native Israelis. This discussion continues up to the recent day, namely in the books by former Matzpen member Shlomo Sand. One of his last publications was entitled "While I Stopped Being Jewish, an Israeli Position." Despite its discursive aftermath, the idea of a Hebrew culture remained rather short-lived. Just like the Six-Day War had revealed the external conflict of the Israeli state foundation, the Palestine question, and brought it to the surface again, it should also shape the internal cultural clash about the nature of the Jewish state. Seeing the religiously charged places in the new territories was for many Israelis like encountering a deeper, forgotten self, as a contemporary had put it. Thus, the Jewish components of the collective self came to the fore again and took precedence over Hebrew culture. In the history of Matzpen, this contrast was never more visible than on September 27, 1967, when questions about the character of the new state mixed up with the return of the Palestine question. While the Israeli press published the declaration of the movement for a greater Israel, Eine, andere, on the one hand, an advertisement appeared on the pages of Haaretz on the other, which warned against the consequences of the occupation and called for an immediate withdrawal from all occupied territories. The authors and supporters of the ad included Chaim Hanekbi and Moshe Machova from Matzpen, but with Shimon Zabar and Dan Omer also the left wing of the secular Hebrew culture. It was one day with two declarations that represented two absolutely different trends of Israeli self-perception. Nonetheless, the Six-Day War had also led to a rupture among the exponents of this secular Hebrew culture and intensified an ongoing antagonism between Matzpen and Uri Avneri's Ha'olam Hazeh. While Avneri had encouraged the Israeli army with the headline "Our goal is Damascus" and voted for the incorporation of East Jerusalem immediately after the war, it was Matzpen's declared solidarity with the Palestinian organizations which provoked harsh reactions on the pages of Ha'olam Hazeh. Thus, although the years after the Six-Day War became the heydays of Matzpen, the group experienced hostility from almost every part of Israeli society. But it was not only the Israeli year of 1967 whose central meaning shaped the history of Matzpen. Coming to the fourth point, I want to show how much it was linked also to the year of 1968, the year of the global New Left. The conjunction of both temporal icons made the so-called solidarity with Palestine a crucial element of the New Left. Thus, the international importance of Matzpen had increased. Moreover, the group had won many new members after 1967 that were motivated by their political rejection of the occupation and by their moral identification with the occupied Palestinians. However, with the new members, also the different political spectrums of the European left found their way into Matzpen. Here, they caused the typical process the left repeatedly undergoes, by arguing over the future of revolution, and in Israel mainly with regard to different possible solutions of the Palestine conflict. The group subdivided into many different splinter groups. This process had begun already in 1970, when two streams from the French left entered Matzpen. On the one hand, an esoteric branch of Trotskyism had believed in the revolutionary force of an international proletarian and gathered around the ideas of Pierre Lambert. On the other hand, the followers of the so-called tiers-mondisme, a kind of third world nationalism, On the other hand, the followers of the so-called tiers-mondisme, a kind of third world nationalism. Within Matzpen, this branch was closely tied to Ilan Halevi, who just 2 years ago had passed away. Halevi had immigrated to Israel only in 1965, after he had supported the national liberation movements in Angola, Mali, and Algeria, considering himself a traveling salesman of the revolution. Now, he attempted to transfer his perspective of the anti-colonial revolution, being the vanguard of universal liberation, also onto the Palestine conflict. Halevi did not stick as closely to the basic premise of Matzpen, according to which the solidarity with the Palestinians was also preconditioned by the recognition of the Israeli Jews as a nation belonging equally to the region. Instead, he founded his own group, Ma'avak, Struggle, by claiming a more unconditional solidarity with the Palestinian organizations. The dramatic consequences of this political reorientation should become clear only 1 year and another split off later, in autumn 1971. Then Udi Adiv, whose origins lay in the socialist elite kibbutz Gan Shmuel, chose to go underground and got lost into a parallel world of Jewish-Palestinian armed struggle. Although being stopped already in its very beginnings, the so-called Jewish-Arab Spiring, as the group around Adiv was soon called, had given the Jewish state a severe shock in December 71. Somebody from the heart of Israeli society had dared to switch sides and now supported the Palestinians in their armed struggle. And by that, he had damaged some of the political reputation of Matzpen, despite the fact that the group had set itself distinctly apart from Udi Adiv and the so-called Red Front. Matzpen actually took the opposite direction when the group entered a period of mere political realism sometimes later. After all, the Yom Kippur War in 1973 had rang a new era for political negotiations in the Middle East, which via Jerusalem and Cairo led to the historic Camp David agreement between Israel and Egypt. After the war had ended, also the Palestinians had slowly stepped away from their former position of intransigence and relativized their demand for so-called liberation of the entire Palestinian soil for the benefit of territorial sovereignty in all territories regained from Israel. This was the first move towards a territorial compromise, so-called two-state solution. And it was due to this compromise that Matzpen also endured several discussions. The left critics of a diplomatic solution, who had splintered off from Matzpen already some years earlier to establish their own organization, the Revolutionary Communist League around Michal Warszawski, labeled this concept pejoratively as a Palestinian mini-state, which they regarded as nothing less than a misleading treat from a revolutionary solution to the Palestine conflict. For Ilan Halevi, in contrast, the diplomatic turn after the war was the first step to turning his back to his former socialist utopian ideas, which concurred with his later conversion to becoming a member of the PLO, and even a Palestinian, a Jewish Palestinian. What was more important at the time, pragmatic considerations have led to a meeting that took place in London in November 75. Here, Moshe Machova met with Said Hamami, the local representative of the PLO, who like nobody else embodied the position of compromise among the Palestinians. With outspoken respect, they had expressed their mutual political recognition in order to discuss a two-state solution in the near and a shared municipality in the far future. This meeting marks the high peak of the diplomatic attempts by Matzpen. Still, those attempts were not crowned by success, and this is not solely due to the fact that Machova could by no means speak for Israeli society. Some Palestinians did not welcome the diplomatic solution either and opposed it with extreme hostility, a hostility Hamami himself had to pay for with his life only 3 years later. In retrospective, it could seem as if the first approaches between Machova and Hamami were somehow the predecessors for political developments much later. Matzpen, however, had never lost its marginality and remained with its radical thoughts at the margins of Israeli politics. The opposition the new left had to face within Israeli society, and I come to my last point, also rooted in a historical constellation that went far beyond the situation in the Middle East. With their voluntary willingness to sacrifice emblems of national sovereignty, or even the Jewish state as a whole, Matzpen had collided with the inexorable impact of the brutal destruction of Jewish life in Europe. The Jewish experience of Auschwitz was not at the center of Matzpen's ideological self-perception. The impact which the annihilation of European Jewry exercised on the collective existence of the Jews after the Holocaust remained somehow concealed to Matzpen. But while the Six-Day War had brought the Palestine conflict to the surface again, the weeks before the war had been generally characterized by a return of the traumatic memories of the Holocaust. The defense of Israel's borders was also seen as a defense of the borders of Auschwitz. It was already in the late 50s when the Marxist historian Isaac Deutscher emphasized, and I quote him, that Auschwitz represented the terrible cradle of a new Jewish consciousness that had changed all former conceptions of Jewish existence. And I continue with the quote, I have, of course, long since abandoned my anti-Zionism, which was based on a confidence in European society and civilization, which that society and civilization have not justified, Deutscher wrote. For the remnants of European Jewry, the Jewish state has become a historic necessity. End of quote. Thus, Israel became a reference in Jewish life that was not so much related to former ideologies or voluntary decisions, but simply to the effects of the Holocaust. In contrast, the Israeli leftists of Matzpen, rooted in a political culture of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that was somehow detached from that part of history. The traditional political and ideological discourses on Jewish existence had remained somehow unaffected by the events in Europe. Those discourses later on proved to be barriers in acknowledging the Holocaust and its meaning for the Jewish collective awareness. This also held true for the continuation of a Zionist teleology after the Holocaust, which was reassured that the Jewish state was both the primary objective of Jewish history and the only guarantor of the mere Jewish existence, although the horrific dimensions of the Nazi genocide had created a different truth at this point. It was not by chance that Matzpen has highlighted for their own cause how the political theology of Zionist Palestinocentrism in some ways obscured the fact that the Yeshuv's survival was based on the British efforts rather than the Zionist ones. After all, the Nazis had not planned to spare the Jews of Palestine from the fate of European Jewry, from the fate of European Jewries, and the Yeshuv owed its lucky survival to the victory of the British troops over the German in El Alamein in 1942. Still, the Zionist utopian idea was preserved in the young state structure and considered to be a political instance of salvation which had proven correct and historically proactive in comparison to European Jewry. Against the background of the Palestine conflict, the Israeli leftists of Matzpen argued that the catastrophe of the Holocaust by no means proved the validity of Zionism and that the continuity of Zionism would rather endanger Israeli Jewry and turn against the Palestinian Arabs or the Palestinians. The political argument of Matzpen, however, stating that the continuation of the Zionist politics would root into theoretical grounds that had proven wrong in history, finally turned towards the critics themselves. The idea of a Hebrew nation on the one hand and socialist revolution on the other kept also Matzpen, the post- and anti-Zionist children of Zionism, somehow a distance to a new historical reality and the new collective notions of Jewishness after Auschwitz. The temporal pivot of the reinvention as New Hebrews in 1944, long before the emergence of Matzpen, can almost be regarded as a self-immunization to the simultaneous events in Europe. This antinomy persisted in Israeli history, namely in the cultural habitus of a young generation of Sabras who reacted with a certain incomprehension to the horrors endured by Holocaust survivors. When Matzpen adopted the concept of a new Hebrew nation for their own cause, it was used in opposition to a sacred legitimization of the Jewish state, and also a helpful tool towards the Palestinians for demanding the recognition of Israeli Jewry as a post-Zionist nation that belongs to the region. In light of the catastrophe of European Jewry that somehow united most of the Jews in a shared experience of memory, the concept of a separate Hebrew nation had already been denied in history. By sticking to the faith in progress that was rooted in the socialist teleology of history, this distance to the consequences of mass extermination increased even further. And this happened despite the fact that Matzpen had inherited the revolutionary hopes of East European Jewish communists of the interwar period. But while the young Israeli leftists followed up on the historical program of overcoming both the Jewish question and Zionism by a socialist revolution, this idea had proven terribly futile for the older Jewish communists. For some of the Jewish communists who had been able to escape death, Israel had become the last refuge, not as a consequence of Zionism, but as a consequence of Auschwitz. At the end of Matzpen's history as presented here stands the shipwreck of Jewish and Israeli utopias that were later picked up again to secure a shared future for Israelis and Palestinians. Thus, this history entails an irresolvable conflict. The tension between the perpetual effects of the Holocaust on the one hand and the unresolved Palestine question on the other. Political conclusions change depending on which perspective you choose. That Matzpen had privileged the perspective of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I come to a conclusion, that needs no more explanation. But it was against this backdrop that the group was also deeply concerned about the emergence of a political discourse where different historical constellations were mixed up, as if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was a repetition of the Jewish fate in Europe. In contrast, the new leftists rather worried that the intrusion of memories from the European past into the perception of Israel's conflict in the Middle East would lead to further aggravation and conceal every possibility for a solution. To emphasize the independent history and the structure of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was therefore a major effort of Matzpen as well as an act of historical responsibility. Even more, Matzpen's enduring historical legacy is to have opened up a perspective of mutual understanding in this conflict, one that involves both the secure existence of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs based on equality and recognition, whatever the shared ways of cohabitation in the region might ultimately be. Thank you.